We continue with Josephus, my wife. Okay. So, where we left off, as you may remember, Josephus had returned from Rome with tremendous success. He was 23 years old. He somehow was sent to Rome to bring back the Kohanim who had been arrested. He was in a major sea wreck. He arrived in Rome, quickly made friends with the wife of the emperor, and was able to get the release of the Kohanim, seemed with almost no trouble at all, and got on a boat and brought them back to Israel. Right? And seems to be a hero. Now, my principle of analyzing Josephus is to try to examine who benefits from his behavior. Right? That's and from his story, right? Other than Josephus himself. So when I look at it, this is an interesting situation. The people who sent Josephus benefited because they brought the Kohanim home, but we don't know who they were. Right? The Kohanim benefited; they got out of prison, right? I would think that one of the major benefits would be Rome, because they sent back somebody who was a hero and a friend of the wife of the emperor, if not the emperor himself. And he returned victorious. So this is who he is at age 23, when he has returned home.
Is that not also he was doing a mitzvah of redeeming a captive?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Just let me add a thing. He might could have been an added inspiration somewhere there that he felt he was doing a Torah mitzvah.
That he was doing, for sure he was doing a Torah mitzvah.
Yeah. I wonder if that was like part of his inspiration, if it, like, you know, or just trying to. So
it was miraculous because he was redeeming a captive. It's a very good point. It certainly would be perceived that. You know, this young guy comes back with such success, you know, so quickly. It would seem miraculous, in fact. And he doesn't give much of an explanation how it actually happened. Just that he finishes by saying, I became acquainted with Alatorius, the actor of plays, and much beloved of Nero, but a Jew by birth, this famous actor, and through his interest became known to Poppaea, Caesar's wife, that's Nero's wife, and took care, as soon as possible, to entreat her to procure the priest might be set at liberty. And when besides this favor I had obtained many presents from Poppaea, I returned home again. That's where we finished last week. Right? And what happened? And now I perceived that new movements were already begun. It seems something happened while he's in Rome. New movements had already begun.
Where in Israel?
He's home now.
Yeah.
He's home now.
Okay.
And that there were many, and there were a great many with high hopes of a revolt from the Romans. So here he is returning home with the good graces of the Rome. He's been very impressed by Rome itself, the magnificence of Rome, and the generosity, it seems. I therefore tried to put a stop to these disorderly persons and persuaded them to change their minds.
Who tried? He?
What? He did.
He tried to.
He said, I tried to. Right? Therefore, I tried to put a stop to these disorderly persons and persuaded them to change their minds, and laid before their eyes against whom it was that they were going to fight. Right? And told them that they were inferior to the Romans, not only in martial skill, but also in good fortune. This is not something that would endear you to your fellow rebels, I would say, or nationalists.
But maybe
right?
It was a bitter truth.
In fact, history
He
will
wanted to save their lives.
History will prove that you're right. That they weren't victorious, and they suffered great pain. Right? And he was saying, this is what's going to come if you fight these people. And I desired them not rashly, and after the most foolish manner, to bring on the dangers of the most terrible mischiefs upon their country, and upon their families, and upon themselves. And this I said with vehement exhortation, because I foresaw the end of such a war would be most unfortunate for us. So he was somebody who was against the rebellion against Rome.
You know, he's an intelligent person. He probably made an assessment. He said, like we were discussing, he was an intelligent person. He's making an honest assessment. I mean, what are we doing if we're not going to win?
But the idea...
That certainly is how he portrays himself.
But probably the rebels could have thought, well, we have Hashem. He might have looked at it that way.
Because he addressing it saying, you are not fortunate. What does it mean, fortunate? It means God is not on your side. Or there is no God. What does it mean to be fortunate?
Is he saying that we should serve Rome?
Well,
because we have no choice.
Yeah, but after so many years at Rome,
if Hashem...
we saw Rome, we saw what Rome is capable of.
Well, we know that,
the might of Rome.
As we read the prophets, when it comes to the king of Babylon, it's written that Hashem gave all the nations into the hands of the king of Babylon to serve him. Right? So, sometimes it's Hashem's will that we're under the domination, because of our sins, we're under the domination of foreign power. It's not ultimately as well, but it happens. So when,
So Josephus has come
maybe he's thinking that.
Josephus, who himself is from a priestly family.
Yeah.
From a priestly family himself, has come to the conclusion that for whatever the reasons are, it would be better that we serve Rome than we fight Rome. So this is how he presents it, clearly. You would see him as a pacifist, really, right? That he wants to find a diplomatic solution to this problem. It all seems very sensible, right? And certainly he portrays this person himself as a very sensible person.
And as you're saying, that view of his also serves the interests of Rome. It keeps if they were to listen to him.
It's a very interesting point. And, by the way, notice that, he describes people who disagree with him with fairly harsh terms. And we're not talking here simply about the extremists, the Sicarii. But the Pharisees are in this group. The Essenes are in this group, right? All those who oppose Rome and are willing to go to war with Rome are in a group of people that he describes as rash and foolish, right? But certainly, having written this in hindsight after the Roman victories, he certainly seems to describe himself as a fortune teller, a seer. He sees what's coming, and his motives seem to be to protect the welfare of the Jewish people.
Yeah, and maybe their lives.
Yeah, in fact. If they listen to him...
He's not just pacifist, but maybe a rationally thinking person. Those were revolutionaries.
Yeah.
Che Guevara's.
That's right.
Of that time.
Absolutely.
They didn't care about lives.
Yes.
Okay, half of us will be killed, but we will win.
Exactly.
Same as Mao Zedong was saying.
Unfortunately, we didn't have as many as the Chinese to fight this fight. Right?
Yeah.
So that is a good position to save Jewish lives.
And listen to how courageous he was, in fact. He did this at the danger to his own life. I was then afraid, lest by repeating these things too often, remember how he describes it, saying it, right? Vehement exhortations. That's like speeches he was making, right? And so then he came to the conclusion, I was then afraid, lest by repeating these things so often, I would incur their hatred and their suspicions, as if I were of our enemy's party, and should run into the danger of being seized by them and killed, since they were already in possession of Antonia. I'll come back to this in a second, which was the citadel. So he's making clear in advance, if you might think that I'm a traitor, you have the same point of view as the extremists that were responsible for the death of all the Jews. It's a very kind of interesting setup he has, right? Mm-hmm. Now, there is some truth to it, because people who are enemies of the revolutionaries did put their lives on the line. There's no question. But remember who he is, right? He comes from a Tzadduki family who claims to have become a Pharisee, who found favor in Roman eyes, brought the priests back, right? And now he's saying, I saw Rome. Back off. We're not going to succeed. Is he doing this because he's trying to protect the lives? He's a rational person trying to protect the lives of Jewish people, or is he doing this to smooth the path of Roman conquest and suppression of a righteous revolution? I think that so far the jury is out on this one.
But like I say, what you are saying, like the second point, so maybe later on that there was maybe this was one of the reasons that they called him a traitor.
Well, I think it's both. I think his rationale was to save his own people's lives, but at the same time that did serve the interests of Rome.
Yeah.
You know, it makes it easier for them if he could get his people not to fight Rome.
Right.
But
so you're saying that he was.
He may have cared about his people and didn't want them to fight because he saw it was a losing battle. And, of course, that would be also good for Rome because, you know.
So from a rational point of view, he said, we can't win this, right? And coincidentally, my point of view is very good for Rome. They can conquer, they can suppress a rebellion without having to fight, basically.
So it's like he's a double agent?
Well, it's just a consequence of his... If he says, I'm for the Jew, I don't want to see them wiped out by Rome, automatically, by default, Rome benefits. It doesn't mean he had that, I'm going to help both sides. One is a consequence of the other, but maybe he did have a little bit of affection for Rome. He's awed by Rome, you know, like, you know.
Listen, the people, rabbis who were against Rabbi Akiva naming Bar Kokhba Moshe, we never suggest that they are spies of Rome. We think that they have a different point of view.
Correct. Correct. But by the way, it's you can't actually compare the two times. They are more than a generation apart, and there was much more unity during the Bar Kokhba revolt than there was during the initial revolt against Rome, in which there were very strongly opposing, we're going to see this, opposing forces within Israel. And this, by the way, is a lesson for us today. You know, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which ended unsuccessfully as well, we know, at least had the overwhelming support of Jews. This revolt that we're reading about now, it seems it was very, very mixed as to which side each Jew was on for different reasons. And it's very clear that when we are divided, we are severely weakened, and so we should pray for unity of purpose for Israel today, going forward.
100%.
So let's see. So Antonia, right? This fortress is very important, or Antonia. The fortress was built by Herod. He rebuilt it over a previous fortress which guarded the gates.
Was it located?
What?
Where was it located? Where was it located?
I'm going to show you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm going to show you. And it was originally built to guard the gates of Rome, of the temple, leading into the temple. However, the Romans, in their wisdom, understood it as having another purpose. Okay, here's the easiest one. Okay, so as you can see, this is the Temple Mount here. This is the temple itself, right? This is all of Jerusalem at the time. Right?
Mount of Olives on the
And-
side, right?
What?
Mount of Olives is where your hand is, right?
I'm sorry.
Mount of Olives.
Hard to
Yeah.
see.
Yes. Yeah. Over here on the north side is the Antonia citadel and fortress, right? Okay. It had 4 towers and it was virtually impregnable. And it guarded the gates that led closest into the temple itself, right? And its purpose was to protect the entrance into the temple. However, under Herod, who rebuilt it as very high towers, it was used by the Romans to follow what was going on inside the temple walls. So that was there rebellion, what's really going on during Sukkot, for instance, during the pilgrimage holidays, right? And not only that, but the garments, the Big Day Kahuna, the garments of the high priest, were not stored in the temple. Antonia. The Romans held on to them. Each day, the Kohen Gadol had to get his clothes from the Romans.
Why did they do that?
Why? Because it basically cripples him. He can't perform the services of the Kohen Gadol without the Big Day Kahuna.
So if they want something, they can say, okay, well, if you don't do this or that,
What the Romans are basically saying is, today you're not the Kohen Gadol. If you don't have the outfit, the clothes, in this case, the clothes do make the man.
Yeah.
You cannot perform the service of the Kohen Gadol without the Big Day Kahuna. And every night, at the end of the day, they took back the Big Day Kahuna and put it in their fortress.
Because it was a valuable object, or
because it was control. It was power, entire power play. No,
control.
they have much more valuable objects in the temple than the clothes, right? No, it controlled the temple service, right? If on a Tuesday they said, well, we really don't like what you did yesterday. Your Devar Torah, what you said about the emperor? We sent your clothes out for dry cleaning today. Sorry. No clothes today. Right? No, that means there's no sacrifice.
There is a halacha that clothes cannot be collateral. Very interesting.
For the Roman, well, first of all,
in Jewish law, it's
they did not follow the Jewish law.
No, but it's very interesting why Gemara takes this, because probably this case show how clothes is collateral.
That makes the best sense because because so many people go into the temple as a gathering place, and it could be a potential gathering place for rebellion.
It was.
So by doing that, it keeps them from wanting to spread ideas that could.
Today on the Temple Mount, Lahavdil, in the different mosques, what people say is blood curdling. Absolutely blood curdling.
Well,
right? From the Roman point of view, right? You have something to say. Act like a priest. Don't act like a rebel, right? And if you're going to act, and remember, who was choosing who the priests were at that point, right? That came from the Romans choosing who. So he was very much under their thumb. And one of the ways they had to deal with it was they kept his clothes, in their fortress, right? The fortress that had originally been built to protect the temple was now being used to spy on the temple and to control the priestly service at this point. However, at this point, Josephus says it's not in Roman hands. It's in the hands of the rebels, he's saying.
When he came back, it wasn't.
Yeah, there was a view that who controls the temple controls Jerusalem.
But who was the king at that very moment in time when he came back in Judea?
That's
wasn't there.
Agrippa. Agrippa II would have been the king at the time, but he wasn't the person who was in power. We're going to come to it in a second. It was
the rebels were controlled as they seized it.
At this moment, that's what Josephus is telling us. Okay. Right? There was a statement that said that who controls Jerusalem controls Israel, right? Who controls the temple controls Jerusalem. Who controls Antonia controls the temple. Right? So at this point, or Antonia, depending on how you pronounce it. So Josephus is saying to us that he was very nervous about his own life. and that I could run in danger of being seized by them and killed, since they were already possessed Antonia. So while he was in Rome, it seems, some Jews had taken the fortress of Antonia from the Romans. It's unclear. Let's go a little further.
David.
Which was a citadel. Yes.
Herod was not there anymore, not in power anymore at that time. It was already past many years.
Herod,
already
probably,
after
because Herod would never
building.
let anybody take control of that.
Huh?
No, he was already passed.
He was
This is
passed.
after Herod's
That's
time.
what I'm saying. It was after him.
So I retired. Into the inner court of the temple. Right? He's a priest. He's a Kohen. Right? So he can go someplace where nobody else can go. To the inner court. That's where he went to. Right? Yet did I go out of the temple again after Menachem and the principal of the band of robbers were put to death, when I abode among the high priests and the chief of the Pharisees. So Menachem was part of the Sicarii, and he was killed. He was one of the founders of the Sicarii, who were the assassins, and they were extremists. They weren't zealots, but they were extremists, right? And once he was killed, Josephus felt, and he was killed by the Romans, he felt more secure to go out. So he was very threatened by Menachem. He knew that. It sounds like the price on his head. But no small fear seized upon us when we saw the people in arms, when we ourselves knew not what we should do, and were not able to restrain the rebellious.
Who are we?
Well, he seems to be saying that he's traveling among the priests of the temple and the Pharisees, is what he says at this point. And the Pharisees were, the Sadducees as a group, the Tzaddukim as a group, seemed to be very sympathetic to the Romans. Pharisees were not sympathetic to the Romans, but they were also not extremists. They were prepared to rebel and to fight, and Rome, in a sense, radicalized many of the Pharisees. But I wouldn't call them at the extreme end. They're much more in the center. And he's claiming that he's hanging with them, right? By the way, they must have been suspect of him as well, because he had a Tzadduki background. So they were probably wondering, what is this guy doing? He comes from this family, but he's fighting with us. Where are his real feelings?
It's about tshuva.
So he didn't. It says we did not know how to restrain the rebellious. However, as the danger was directly upon us, we pretended that we were of the same with them, but only advised them to be quiet for the present and to let the enemy go away. So what he's saying? He's saying we didn't say we opposed their point of view. We said you're entitled to your point of view, but don't talk about it too much, because you're just going to get us all in trouble, right? But I'm really with you, right? He's making clear that he's telling them a different view than he holds, right? I hold we shouldn't fight with Rome. I didn't say that to them. I said to them, I'm sympathetic to your point of view. You should know that. But to be effective, now is the time to be quiet, not rebellious. That's what he said. And what was his motive? But I only advised them to be quiet for the present and to let the enemy go away, still hoping that Geshes Florus would not be long before he came, and that with great forces, and so put an end to these rebellious proceedings.
Geshes what?
His name, I'll tell you about him in a second. Geshes Florus. Right? So now this brings into question a lot of things. He turns to his friend and he says, I share the same point of view as you do, but don't be noisy about it, be quiet about it. And all the time he's hoping that the Roman legions will come and put an end to these people. Now, you could argue, and you could argue, that putting an end to these rebellious Jews quickly puts an end to the rebellion, and in the long term will save many more Jews. Maybe that's his logic, right? You could argue that, and I think he will, right? But he's getting pretty close to the line here of being a traitor, I would say.
But okay, but Rome has already been ruling there for over 100 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So during
in one way or another, Rome has been.
So in one sense, they had a measure of peace for 100 years, although Rome ruled them. But nobody was being outright slaughtered. At least I don't know. That I know of.
Yes, they were.
There was a lot of
crucifixion was popular, as you know. Right?
So you could see maybe where the seeds.
But look at his phrase: still hoping that Geshephus would not be long before he came. That's a Roman legion we're talking about.
First of all, he is aware of their plans and their...
Isn't that interesting, right?
Yeah, he knows too much.
How does he know when the Romans are even on their way?
Yeah.
So let's see who Geshephus is.
Yes, it's how you pronounce it. You did twice different things.
Gessius Florus. Or Gessius Florus. G. G. He was the Roman procurator of Judea from 64 to 66. Not very long. Right? He was born in Clazmenate, not so important, somewhere in Italy. Florus was appointed to replace Lucius Albinus as the procurator by the Emperor Nero due to his wife's friendship with Nero's wife, Poppaea.
That's how I knew everything.
Interesting, huh? He was noted for his public greed and injustice to the Jewish population, and is credited as being the primary cause of the Great Jewish Revolt. Right? His brutality radicalized people.
So he was more in touch with the Romans than he was with
actually
Jews,
hoping that they would come and put out the rebellion. So that makes you wonder.
Right. Now, just so we're clear, remember this. There's a connection here, right? Right. The wife of Caesar was very close to his wife, Florus's wife, right? She was also, it seems, a fan of Josephus.
I think she was using Josephus. I think that he was, like, when he was there, they probably was playing him.
You think they were playing him?
Successfully.
So maybe that's true.
Because, he's not a Roman, he's a Jew, and they said, what can we do? How can we use him for our advantage? And it seems like it's working, because now, maybe, who knows what she said to him? She's probably sure cookie.
She was speaking speaking from him all the information about the Jews? That's what you mean?
No, I don't know. I'm just saying
You're saying something happened in Rome.
Yeah, that somehow, she could probably, they used him more than he used. He might have got the captives back, but they probably saw him. We could use him for an advantage. You just think about it. He's gone back, and now he's hoping that these guys can put out the rebellion. It seems like either they were able to dupe him into believing that, they had a better cause, or, who knows? I'm just trying to say, why would he?
So we have in the middle of the temple a priest who is telling the rebels to slow down, to be quiet, and at the same time hoping that the Roman legions are going to arrive and kill them. That's what it seems. That's clear, right?
Hoping.
He says hoping. He says hoping in his own words. I'm hoping that Geshephus would not be long before he came, and with great forces to put an end to the rebellious proceedings.
Well, I guess you could see this. He felt his life threatened, and that means there might have been a lot of other peaceful Jews who were afraid to speak up, that didn't want the rebellion, seeing them. Right. And so maybe in a way this group was almost the enemy of the Jews who were peaceful. It's like in radical Islam. the other ones don't speak up against it because they're afraid of getting killed.
I don't want to get into that conversation. I don't want to get into that conversation.
I'm not saying it's the same, but I'm just saying that maybe that...
You know, I say lahavdil.
Yeah, lahavdil.
I'm just saying, though, let's say he was afraid. I mean, let's say he thought it was wrong to rebel, and there was a lot of other Jews, so he may have felt threatened by them.
So he's saying,
I don't know.
He's saying if the Romans kill the extremists, we're all probably better off for that.
Cool.
Right? Mm-hmm. It is what what you're saying, isn't it?
Well, that's what he's saying.
That's what you're interpreting his statement, right? I agree with you. Mm-hmm. I agree with you, right? But there's an awful lot of pieces to this that are only beginning to fit together, which, you know, we're on a long journey here about this very interesting character. You're suggesting that something happened in Rome, right?
Because
it may be possible that the reason he went to Rome was because something had already happened. Remember, Florus, now backtrack, right? Turn the video back. You got to speak backwards and walk backwards, right? Now go backwards, right? This procurator, Gessius Florus, right, was the procurator when he went to Rome. His wife is close to the emperor's wife.
So you're saying maybe he went to Rome really, the captains weren't the real mission, it was to report to Rome about what was going on against these rebels, and maybe...
Perhaps it was to make him a hero
to Rome?
when he returned.
Got to know the Popeye,
to Israel.
He got to know Popeye not through the actor. He already knew about her.
Before he left.
He had a card from her friend.
Your idea
said,
that...
when you're there...
Your idea that it was set up, right, falls into place very well here. It wasn't set up in Rome. In Judea, right, when he was chosen by somebody, we don't know who, to release the Kohanim, the person who was in charge of Israel, his wife, this Roman procurator, his wife was close with Nero's wife. When he gets to Rome, somehow she's very interested in meeting him and making sure he gets gifts and returns to Israel tremendously successful in his nationalist effort to return innocent priests back to Israel. Right? And now he's praying for this guy to show up and kill the... Well, he doesn't say praying. Hoping is his description. That Rome will that this fellow will return and kill the extremists as he perceives them, the rebellion. Let me just finish with our procurator. So it says about him, right? Upon taking office in Caesarea, Florus began the practice of favoring the local Greek population of the city over the Jewish population. This is a very important concept that's going to play throughout our story, is that Israel was not solely Jewish at all. There were many other nationalities already in Israel that existed and had a lot of authority and power and strong relations with Rome. So the idea of the majority, which were Jews, being neglected or being persecuted, and the Greeks or the Syrians or the Scythians or others being shown privilege, lower taxes, all kinds of other things, right, was something that caused the Jewish population to seethe with anger because it was so unjust. We'll see this as a theme that continues throughout our story. Florus began the practice of favoring the local Greek population of the city over the Jewish population. The local Greek population noticed Florus's policies and took advantage of the circumstances to denigrate the local Jewish population. One notable instance of provocation occurred while the Jews were worshiping in their synagogue, and a Hellenist sacrificed several birds on top of an earthenware container at the entrance of the synagogue, an act that rendered the building ritually unclean. In response to this action, that's a sure provocation, right? In response to this action, the Jews sent a group of men to petition Forrest for redress. Despite accepting a payment of 8 talents to hear the case, Forrest refused to listen to the complaints and instead had the petitioners imprisoned. Forrest further angered the Jewish population of his province by having 17 talents, that's a heavy weight, removed from the treasury of the temple in Jerusalem, claiming the money was for the emperor, Nero. In response to this action, the city fell into unrest, and some of the Jewish population began openly mock Forrest by passing a basket around to collect money for Forrest because Forrest was poor. Forrest reacted to the unrest by sending soldiers into Jerusalem the next day to raid the city and arrest a number of the city leaders. The arrested individuals were whipped and crucified, despite many of them being Roman citizens. They were Jewish and Roman citizens. After the outbreak of the Jewish revolt, Forrest was replaced by Marcus Antonius Julianus. So this is who he's waiting for to come and take care of his problem. Hoping for. And what happened, right? But upon his coming and fighting, he was beaten, and a great many of those, this is Forrest, and a great many of those were with him, and this disgrace, which Gessius, along with Cestius, his son, received, became the calamity of the whole nation. For those who were fond of the war were so elevated with the success that they had hopes of finally conquering the Romans, of which war was another occasion was ministered, which was this: those that dwelt in the neighboring cities in Syria seized upon such Jews. So what happened? So the Florus, there was a debacle.
He lost control of the...
He walked into an ambush and his soldiers were slaughtered, right? Along with his son's soldiers as well.
What about him?
Right? And they were in disgrace, and the Jews were perceived as rebels. Clearly vicious rebels at this point. They'd attacked the Romans. So the neighboring countries, it's interesting because so much of this plays out over and over and over again. The neighboring countries said, okay, now's our chance to get the Jews. So in Syria and what is today Lebanon and other places, right, they began attacking villages of Jews that were not involved in the rebellion at all. Not at all. But it was an opportunity to kill the Jews and take their belongings. Right?
Spill the blood, why not?
Those that dwelt in the neighboring cities of Syria seized upon such Jews as dwelt among them with their wives and children and killed them when they had not the least occasion of complaint against them. For they did neither attempt any innovation or revolt from the Romans, nor had they given any marks of hatred or treacherous designs towards the Syrians. But what was done by the inhabitants of Scythopolis, which is Beit Shean, was the most impious and most highly criminal of all. For when the Jews and their enemies came upon them from without, and they forced the Jews that were among them to bear arms against their own countrymen, which it is unlawful for us to do. Okay, so it's so interesting to listen to the voice of this man, right? What he's done is made the rebels in Jerusalem who took the fortress and killed the troops of this guy who was very brutal and unfair, responsible for the death of Jews in distant places, right? Right. So
Europe and Israel.
Exactly. So you have a war in Gaza, and Jews in Paris are killed
Well, this
today,
Yeah.
right? And why? Because the Jews are attacking Gazans. Israelis are attacking Gazans. We're not anti-Semitic, right? But this is anti-Zionist, right? So this is exactly what happened, right? And Josephus is the propagandist for this. The enemy are not the Romans. The enemy are not the Syrians. The enemies are the extremist Jews among us.
Well, that's what Peace Now used to say about the settlement. Well, they still do to this day. Settlements are the reason why we're having.
But this is the point, right?
You know,
this is the point, right? So we're seeing elements of history, really quite ancient history, 2,000 years ago, like today's headlines, right? And with that, we'll hold here. Okay.